The goal of this series is to highlight pressing issues that impact all of us and our community. As citizens of New Orleans, citizens of the world, we address a lot of issues, cultural, political, and anything that really impacts all of us. Our goal is to provide a platform for people to be heard, for knowledge and experiences to be shared, with the hope that we achieve a better understanding of the issues in front of us, and hopefully some direction and motivation to be in some way or another part of the solution. So tonight, we're talking about Rape 101. How do we end sexual assault on campus? The act of sexual assault breaks our communities. It's an assault on our dignity and our most basic human rights, the right to live in peace and happiness. The seeds of this issue are both obvious and subtle, and so are the solutions. As with all issues that impact us all, we all have a role to play, both in raising our consciousness and our ability to take action. This is particularly true here today with the report of the Office of the Inspector General, if you're aware of it, that came out today. It's just beyond words. I'm sure it'll come up tonight, and I hope you look at it for yourself. I want to deeply thank everybody who's here as our panel and all of you. And I'm going to introduce our moderator, and Tania Tetlow will then introduce the panelists. So Tania Tetlow, she is the Fayard Early Career Associate Professor of Law and the Director of the Domestic Violence Clinic at Tulane. She received her BA from Tulane in 1992, her JD from Harvard University in 1995. Tania Tetlow is a former federal prosecutor with expertise in family law and the use of legal tools for combating domestic violence. As director of the Domestic Violence Clinic, she teaches students how to practice law while helping clients escape violent relationships. She has done international training of U.S. domestic violence law for scholars and practitioners in Iran, China, Rwanda, and Egypt. She is a member of the U.S. delegation to the 2014 U.S.-China People-to-People Exchange held in Beijing. In New Orleans, she trains police to better respond to violence against women. Tetlow's scholarship focuses on preventing discrimination by juries against both defendants and crime victims. In 2000, Tetlow worked as assistant U.S. attorney focused on violent crime and narcotic cases. In 2009, Tetlow received the Tulane University President's Award for Excellence in Professional and Graduate Teaching. Tania, could you please come on up, and thank you again for being here.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for braving the cold to come out tonight by New Orleans standards. This is a snowstorm. We are here tonight to talk about a problem that has become an epidemic, not become, as Dr. Kondkar will tell us, has been for decades, an epidemic on university campuses. It's a problem of 1 in 5, and arguably more than that, of young women who are sexually assaulted during their time at a university when they should be beginning their lives and their careers. And as we think about women in leadership, the idea of starting your adult life and your career and your trajectory with a soul-crushing experience like this does fundamental harm to our ability to encourage women in the public sphere and to have them live up to their capacities. It is an awful fact. It is a problem that we are crying to the wilderness about, and we're going to start out tonight talking about the nature of that problem and research that Dr. Kondkar has done about how common this is on campuses. He's worked specifically on Loyola's and at Tulane's in testing this problem, and also about attitudes in very interesting ways. And Dr. Kondkar is a Loyola professor. He is a sociologist. He's won the University Teaching Award. He's an amazing scholar. He's done work on everything from general criminal law and behavior to specifically gender in the law and violence against women. We have Tara Wilson here, who is a Tulane student. She is on SAFE, the Sexual Assault Peer Hotline Education organization here at Tulane. She's also president-elect of the Pan-Hellenic Council, a Tulane cheerleader, and a junior from Houston who's majoring in history and political science. So she is here to talk about the student perspective and the kind of activism that happens on campus. As we think about the problem, we're also going to quickly turn to solutions. And some of this is about a failure of will of universities historically not wanting to recognize the problem, not quite believing that it's true, but also wanting to hide it because there was this relative disadvantage to being the one campus to admit the scope of the problem. So there was this pressure for all of them to keep quiet about it. And that is changing by virtue of a new federal focus from this president and this administration. You're going to hear words like Title IX and the Clery Act thrown around that are putting pressure on that. And also from state efforts to change things. So we have Senator J.P. Morrell from our Louisiana State Senate, who's going to talk about the efforts that he has done to push the public universities that are under his purview to do more. J.P. Morrell has been in the legislature since 2006 and then in the Senate since 2008. He's from New Orleans, grew up in a very prominent, impressive political family, so he's been doing public service since he was old enough to walk. I don't think he had a choice about it. He went to Spring Hill College, where he taught creative writing to homeless kids. He went to Tulane Law School, God bless you, and he's a lawyer who has done a variety of practice from criminal defense to family law to personal injury. But mostly he's in the legislature. And I can't tell you how grateful we are to you for being willing to be in the legislature, because I know it is an interesting experience at times, but where he has really fought for issues like the reforms that happened in domestic violence law this summer. And he has been an absolute champion for the rights of women and now on issues of sexual assault on campus. So we're going to hear about what he's been working on. And then we're going to think about the ways that universities actually honestly struggle with these issues, because some of this is a failure of will, but a lot of this is also that it's very complicated and difficult to know exactly the right thing to do. And so we have the efforts of universities to try to figure out how to litigate these cases, basically how to figure out when somebody is accused of rape, of whether they've done it or not. And in some ways, the olden days, it was that you kicked it to the criminal justice system. And today, we had a reminder, a kick in the shins reminder of why that's not what Whoa. I didn't do anything.
It was a kick in the shin.
That was the kick in the shins. I'm going to turn this off because I talk really loudly. Because there is an Inspector General report released where they'd identified 5 detectives who were problematic from a previous audit, so they went and checked their cases for 3 years, right? It was more than 1,000 cases, and they went and saw how hard are they working on these sexual assault cases and one child abuse detective. And they found that in 86% of them, there was no evidence that they'd done any follow-up investigation. Wow. And I got to tell you, I thought that I couldn't be shocked on this subject, but they managed. So we have literally rape victims making the agonizing choice to come to the police department, to report publicly, to risk the savages of the criminal justice system, which are pretty hard on victims, and only to find out that actually nobody did anything after they gave their initial report. So that's a pretty devastating fact, because we've gotten a lot better with NOPD and apparently slid right back, as I like to say in this word, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. That's our motto. So now universities really have this pressure that they have to figure out these cases for themselves, because you have to give some due process to someone accused of rape before you kick them out. But you also can't let a rapist be on campus with the victim who has to see them every day. So how do we adjudicate these cases and be fair, and we don't have to recreate a criminal justice system? But you're going to hear from 2 people who are on the ground dealing with these issues about how complicated this actually is to work. So one is Scott Schneider, who is an Associate General Counsel at Tulane. He works incredibly hard on Title IX, on the Clery Act, of figuring out what the university should be doing. He came from a Washington and Lee Law School. He came from a practice at a law firm of doing higher education law and employment law, actually more. And now, devastatingly for the university, he's leaving us to go back to his law firm to do higher education law and to give his skills to the greater community, but it really is a huge loss to Tulane. but he's now going to be free to say exactly what he thinks. Because this is his last week at work, so I'm really looking forward to that.
I'm unburdened.
Yes, free at last. And then we have Julia Broussard, also from Tulane. Apologies for the Tulane heavy panel, but these are the people I know best in terms of their passion and their work. And she works in the Office of Student Council, and I'm going to get your title wrong. It is head of the Office of Violence Prevention. Am I getting that? Coordinator of Tulane's Office of Violence Prevention and Support Services, where she works on prevention programs, but also in victim services as victims go through these cases, and she really deals with it on the ground in a way that can only be supported by her training as a social worker. She's an MSW from LSU, from her experience at the Metropolitan Center for Women and Children working with rape victims, and probably a fair amount of drinking, because it is really, really difficult work. So we have an amazing panel. We want to thank them all for coming, and we're going to hear from all of them first before we kick it to question and answer. And we're going to start with a longer presentation from Dr. Kondkar, who's going to show us his research, which you're going to be fascinated by, so we're going to spend a little more time on that. And then I'm going to ask everyone else to give you their initial 5-10 minute thoughts, and then we will ask lots and lots of questions. So thank you all for coming. And we'll start with Marcus.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. Do I need this audio, or is it going to close?
As long as you don't walk in front of the speaker.
Just keep away from
Thanks for having me. It's actually, I've had the privilege of being here before for the Hillel series, the big issue series on we're looking at neighborhood violence in New Orleans. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the findings from the studies that were done at Loyola and Tulane, I'm sort of condensing about 2 hours worth of information into 15 minutes or so. And I'd really like it more to be a catalyst for a conversation than for this to be the conversation. And hopefully that'll get us thinking about some things. Can you advance the slide? Great. So this was done at Loyola first. With a sample size of 500, we then replicated the study at Tulane. And quite honestly, we sort of reached the point of saturation, so it wasn't necessary then to go to another, to Dillard or to UNO. Originally, we were going to do a UNO as well. And what I'm going to talk to you about is mostly from Loyola, but they really are very similar patterns at Tulane. When there's differences, I'll point those out. This is a subset of the respondents. The same questionnaire was given to men and women. This is based on about 300 of the women respondents. Occasionally there's going to be data on men, and that'll be in red. And this is a very, very small piece of this study that actually was more interested in looking at the co-occurrence of sexual violence with stalking and dating violence. We're not going to have time for you to go into that. So again, just demographic characteristics. The main reason for doing this was to make sure I had a representative sample. I could compare it with institutional research and make sure that it's the equivalent. Typical college population with a mean age of about 20. Loyola's campus is about half residential. I think Tulane's a little bit more. And that also, that is relevant to the extent of the locations of sexual assaults, to a certain extent. But as we see, in both cases, most of them actually happen off campus. So I was actually very sensitive to the critiques that studies of sexual assault tend to be vulnerable to. They're accused of exaggerating things or phrasing things in such a way that might it's a problem that really does not have to be exaggerated. But to make sure that I was going to be able to be safe from those charges, I used language that's very sort of behaviorally specific and quite clear. So rather than saying that I was too drunk to consent, I was incapable of resisting. I think that's a slightly different standard. There's only a couple of places in this whole survey where the word rape is used to avoid people's labeling things in different ways. But as you can see, this is the language that's been used. Now, there's the fourth one down there. is a little, adds a little complexity to this, because actually that's not against the law. And being mean is not against the law, and being coercive is not against the law, generally. But the thing is, we have to realize that if we want to do this study in order to really meet women where they are with these issues and try to do something about them, then I think we need to move away from a sort of legalistic sense of these things. But I know that that presents a different challenge for people who are trying to litigate these cases. This is, I just want to get to the heart of this now. So this was all data based on a 12-month period, okay, in the previous 12 months. 37% of the sample reported at least one act of unwanted sexual coercion in the past year. 51% reported over their lifetimes. Okay? Now this includes things that would not necessarily be against the law. Okay, so I do distinguish those things. But 18% of the sample reports experiencing at least one incident that would constitute legal rape under Louisiana law. And 29% is the prevalence. So there's your 1 in 5 number. Again, I've done quite a lot of background research on this. I went back 50 years, and the story is that the story is the same. And that number is about the same number. Our attitudes are slightly different. Certainly the way we talk about these things have changed, but the prevalence and incidence are relatively stable. And then, of course, you know, one of the 2 places where the word rape is used is the very last question. Have you ever been raped? And of the 56 cases that met the definition, only 20% say that they were raped. 26% say they're not sure. But over half the sample says no. And you know, this is I can't escape my own gender with this, and it's been an evolving process for me too. And I'm not sure where I stand on the idea of allowing victims to define their own experiences in ways that make sense to them, or for us to impose a definition on them based on behavioral standards, objective standards. I'm actually sort of, you know, there are pros and cons with both of those things, but that's the way victims self-identify. One of the things, speaking of my male perspective, so the other thing that I learned about this is that I was defining the severity of these incidents by the degree of intrusiveness of the coercion. So I was making sexual intercourse more coercive than oral sex, for example. And I realized that for victims, that's not the way they make sense of things. So what's much more important to a victim of sexual assault is the coercive strategy that's used, as opposed to the degree of intrusiveness. It's all intrusive. And so I think that that's pertinent to people who are trying to help victims, to not make too much of a distinction between how intrusive it is and rather look at the tactic. And there's so much more on this, but I'll just leave it there. So the other thing that I also saw, I was interested in these covariances, but this is just the covariance within sexual coercion. And you can see that the people who are subject to one form of coercion tend to be subject to others. So it's not this picture of it's all just college kids getting drunk. If so, we would see a very clear case. Although being impaired, and I think of that more as rape through incapacitation through alcohol, is the modal category, but it's not the only thing that's going on here. There's so much that's made about the role of alcohol, and I think it's dangerous to make alcohol a causal variable for this. But it's certainly present, and alcohol is present in college students' lives. And so I think that we must be careful not to make a causal relationship out of a correlation. Alcohol is involved, but I don't think it can be fairly seen as the cause of sexual violence. But it is there, as you can see. The one thing I think is worth bearing in mind, there are certain lifestyle things that come together for college students that create these vulnerabilities, and I think alcohol may be one of those vulnerabilities of lifestyle, but it is certainly not the cause. So if you look at women aged 18 to 21 who are not in college, they are at a far less risk of sexual coercion than women who are in college. So there is something about being in the college environment that creates that, and alcohol may be part of that. Now this was for Loyola. Tulane's a little higher. 14% are on campus. 86% are off campus at the very places that students identified feeling safe. Right? There are all these questions about precautions that students take, where they feel unsafe, and of course it's an inverse of where the actual threat is. There's a tendency to think of these things as strangers jumping out of dark places at night when you're going to and from bars and things like that, and that's really not what's happening. The relationship among college students is overwhelmingly friends and acquaintances. That's a little different from the national study that looks outside the college population. But 10% involve strangers, and I think that's the important point here in terms of where the risk is. These things are generally going on between people who are in a relationship and also, of course, having left a relationship, which is a particularly vulnerable time as well. And in this particular case, most of the perpetrators are outside of the institution. Now, this was Loyola, which is predominantly, I think it's 65% women. These are primarily heterosexual relationships that we're talking about, and so that might affect that a little bit. But actually, when I looked at Tulane, it was about the same. Okay, so it's not all college men who are involved here, but it's college women that we're looking at as victims. This is important too, I think, in terms of reporting. So we asked these students, do you know what to do? Do you know what to expect if you're a victim of this and you're considering reporting it? And the vast majority don't know what to do. And I think this is another important thing in terms of intervention. There's so many issues with reporting, but if you don't even know what's going to happen. I think one of the things that happens is a sense of a loss of control as a victim of sexual coercion. And you don't want to lose more control by not being able to control what happens next. And I think that that's part of it. And that's a very easy thing to intervene with. And we can create decision trees that tell students that at this point you're going to lose control of it, or at this point it's not going to be confidential, and you can make much more informed decisions. These things have been done, actually, as a result of this. And then reporting. So less than 4% of respondents who indicate that they experienced sexual coercion that meets the legal definition of rape reported the incident. But of course, we're asking questions of everyone. And of course, 84% of all of the respondents said that they definitely reported if it happened at the beach. There's an interesting thing that Tania Tetlow mentioned at the beginning in terms of sort of barriers to reporting and how these experiences are. In this study, actually, I found that women who had had an experience with sexual assault and had reported it in the past were the least likely to say they would report it again. That's a very damning statistic, I think, in terms of what we're actually, the experience that women then have as a result of reporting. Reasons for not reporting, it's always this sense of feeling partly responsible. That came up over and over and over again, having some role in what happened, and a degree of stigma and shame that comes along with that. And I think also realizing that it's sort of a double victimization to then be dragged through the process. For a lot of women, they would just prefer to put it past them and move on. There were many more, but those were the primary reasons that were given. Now this is, I don't just giving you an example of how you can use this data. So this is looking at the co-relationships between forced sexual coercion. Of course, that doesn't sound quite right, forced sexual coercion, but it's with the forced category. Impaired, overwhelmed, the partner violence, and the stalking. And what those numbers are saying is that there's a very strong correlation between all of those things and forced coercion. So again, these things tend to come they're not solitary events. Now this is where I think we could get into some conversation about this. So there's actually two of these, if you can hit the button again. So these were questions at the end about perceptions and attitudes. They were about dating scripts and norms. And this, the data in red there from men respondents. So what percentage of women are lying because they're angry when we get back? Now, again, most people don't think that that's the most common thing, but the fact that so many do is problematic there. And the fact that a quarter of all men would think that that would be a likelihood is also disturbing. The second one, again, is a sort of similar theme on that. There are quite a few people walking around with that idea in their heads, is what I'm talking about. Now, these questions all have to do with greatly congruent attitudes and self-reports. So Again, these are anonymous surveys, and I think to an extent that no matter how we feel, we're all trained, and some part of our brain is trained to be politically correct with these things as well. And so I suspect that these numbers might actually be higher than they are. But so they have to agree. This is on a Likert scale, and so a woman who goes to the home of an apartment of a man to the first date implies that she's consenting to have sex. So 22% of women agree or strongly agree with that statement. 30%, a third of men agree with that statement. These are relatively educated people we're talking about, bright people as well. If a woman gets a man really excited before bed, she bears some responsibility to men and forces himself onto her. Again, in fact, it's 16% of women and a third of men are in that category. And this is not only agreeing, this is agreeing or strongly agreeing. It's nothing neutral. A woman consents before bed. She's consenting to sex even if she says otherwise. There are fewer who say that, but again, still enough. You know, that's 31 of those women who were sampled who are agreeing with that statement. There are so many of these questions. I'm just highlighting a few of these. The idea of once consent is given, it's forever implied. Again, you know, over a quarter of men are thinking that that's true. Any healthy woman can successfully resist a rapist if she really wants to. That gets into some of the myths about these sort of odd ideas about women having some kind of subconscious desire to be raped. Here are more. It's sort of same theme. Now, they're getting fewer and fewer, but still, the basic sort of theme, I think, comes out of this, right? About consent, about sexual autonomy, about who has the right to say what and when and so forth. And again, the last question was the first of a series of power and control questions. 26% of men think that they should have primary power in a relationship. Again, this one right here just really knocked me for a loop. On a first or second date, a woman should put up some initial resistance to having sex, even if she really wants to, so as not to be thought of as easy. Now, I in the Tulane data, so this was I teased that question out into about 10 questions, because I wanted to make sure it wasn't women saying that that's what other people will think, so therefore I have to, that's the norm, that that's actually how they would feel. And of course, it is actually how I would feel. Presumably, if fewer men feel that way, I suppose they would imagine that there shouldn't be any resistance at all. Now that issue right there, I think, gets to the heart of a lot of the problems. And I think if we're going to have an honest conversation about this, we have to recognize that there's gray. There's a lot of gray in this issue. And when alcohol is involved, that increases the degree of gray, I think. Now, and this dance that goes on is rather confusing for men who are trying to figure out at a relatively early age in their lives what their sexual scripts are, and as women are trying to figure those things out as well. I think that what this is basically saying is that women don't have the right to be sexually autonomous beings without somehow being stigmatized for those things. And I think this is actually a very good point of intervention for this as well. So that's, again, I'm just going to stop there because I'd rather us have a conversation, but there's tons of data that I have on this, and if any of you are interested in getting to more of it, I'm happy to share it with you. So I'll stop there and maybe we can have a conversation about something.
Tara, tell us what this is like for students and the ways that you've tried to work on this problem and what you think.
Okay, well, I'm going to start off with a story. I have a sister. She's a senior in high school. She's maybe coming to Tulane next year. Let's hope so. She was watching the FSU Notre Dame game with some of her friends. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Jameis Winston incident. They were watching the football game, and a guy came up to her and was watching the TV and said, "I don't understand how Jameis Winston could rape anyone. He always gets what he wants." And those kind of stories and those sort of attitudes feed into the culture that makes sexual violence permissible, especially on college campuses, and really indicates that this problem starts early. I know personally throughout high school, I heard all of these incidences thinking back, they're awful. At the time, I didn't even know. I wasn't even educated to be aware that this was problematic. And you know what? It makes me afraid for when my sister does come to college, when these behaviors translate into things that can be dangerous for her. And while we hear the statistics that are extremely informative and important to know that they're the factual evidence that this occurs on college campuses, I've heard some of the stories, I've seen some of the faces and heard the voices of people who are personally affected by sexual violence. And it's frequent and it's awful, and it's just, I'm so glad that all of you are here today, because you being here to talk about this issue is helping solve the problem. Through my involvement with SAFE, a sexual aggression peer hotline and education, it's a 24/7 student-run hotline that helps people affected by sexual violence or sexual aggression, stalking, intimate partner violence in the Tulane community can call and find out resources on campus. And by visiting Dartmouth over the summer and being a part of the Greek Life Against Sexual Assault group, I've seen students engaged in this problem, and it makes me really optimistic and hopeful that students are engaging and want to do something about the problem. And it makes me optimistic because these numbers that have really stagnated, this 1 in 5, can drop and become lower, and people don't have to be affected by this anymore. But at the same time, it's challenging being an activist on this issue. This isn't something fun to talk about. It's not something that just because you offer free food, students show up. It's one of those things that really you have to have a discussion about it, because there are a lot of gray areas, and sex isn't always something people are so eager to be open about. So that's, from an activist perspective, I think student engagement is one of the things. Like, SAFE is available, the Student Resources Office on Tulane's campus, the Title IX office, all these resources are available to students, but they just don't know about it because how do you engage with them? And that's a question I'm constantly asking myself and asking other people. What is that key thing to get students engaged and talking? And it's really challenging. But again, I am optimistic. I've talked to people and faculty, staff, and students alike from Tulane and across the country who are so passionate about this issue. And again, thank you all for coming today. I feel like engaging in this conversation and the passion that I see is going to help solve this problem in the long run. Thank you.
Senator Morrell, you are dealing with this from kind of above, trying to deal with it in legislation to figure out how the LSU system, UNO, the public universities can do better. Talk to us about what you're doing. Are you getting resistance? What do you think the issues are? How should we be doing better on the campuses?
I think it's important to start kind of with my own arc in this journey. And historically as a legislator, typically when I do a bill, it's brought to me by somebody, by request, so to speak. With the tremendous work we did with domestic violence this past year, that was really the result of a cadre of activists who had done all the legwork and simply needed myself and Representative Moreno to kind of carry them across the finish line. The bill I did 2 years ago in cataloging rape kits backlogs, that was brought to me by several activist groups who had challenges as far as getting accurate data from law enforcement as to whether they were processing sexual assault kits. On this issue, this was more of something I stumbled upon with the horrifying discovery. And I'm sure many of you are aware of recently Senator McCaskill's report on sexual assault on campuses. And after that report came out, a friend sent it to me, and I sat down and I read it. And it was the most horrifying thing I'd ever read in my entire life, honestly. When I looked through it, this anonymous data and these really honest answers from people currently on college campuses, seeing what was happening to people on college campuses was just terrifying. And my first reaction beyond that horror was the data that McCaskill was able to compile was an anonymous survey, which was a composite across the entire United States. So as far as being a legislator in Louisiana, there was no way I could derive from that data what the current status of sexual assault on college campuses was in Louisiana. That led me to pen my infamous letter to the Board of Regents saying, well, I want the data for Louisiana. And that led to another horrifying instance. I'm sure many of you who have been able to have seen the report, which is posted in a lot of different sources, as far as this 305-page report I got from a variety of public universities across Louisiana. Well, it seems like a very impressive number, 305 pages. Well, when you pull that down, most universities simply reprinted their handbooks, and I mean the entire handbook. Not the section on sexual assault, I mean when you pay your tuition to get your diploma, just the entire thing, part and parcel, which was disturbing. Some of the universities that responded gave me their information on how they deal with intra-office sexual harassment, which obviously, just looking at definitions, that is not at all what I was asking for. What I derived from the variety of answers I got from across the state was that there was no basic framework for sexual assault, how to respond to it on Louisiana campuses whatsoever. You had certain universities that got parts of it right. University of Louisiana at Lafayette has a very robust process in which they publicly and have a detailed mechanism for when you report to when it's resolved or dealt with. You had universities like University of Louisiana at Morrell that had a very robust educational program where they actively sought out freshmen and tried to educate them on sexual assault and what constitutes it. Everyone else was somewhere in between. And there was really basic data that I requested in that report that either I didn't get or when I got it was more horrible than I thought. A great example, which I always cite, is I asked these universities, how many instances of sexual assault have you had reported in a 5-year period? LSU, Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge flagship campus, had 25 in 5 years, which was completely mind-blowing. To put that in context, and I have to defend someone on the radio attacking me, a Tiger fan, obviously, about how I was blowing it out of proportion. He said, well, I mean, what's the national average? I said, well, it's anywhere from 20% in some reports to as low as 5%. He goes, well, where's LSU fit in that? I said, let's do math. LSU has 30,000 students per year. 5% is 1,500. They're saying 25 over 5 years. If you don't see something wrong with that, we can't really continue this conversation. So obviously when I got that report, I was pretty horrified, and the first thing I thought of, well, what can I do? Well, as a legislator, we really can't do much when we're out of session. We do study committees all the time, but even those require legislative action. This all happened not in session. So I came up with the bright idea to create a study group, which is very informal, but would help me and some other legislators really craft legislation for the next session. And that study group has met one time. We are in the process of developing some subcommittees, but we have some basic ideas on kind of areas which everyone's kind of in universal agreement that we think we can accomplish and would take great steps towards improving the climate in the state of Louisiana. The first is, obviously from the McCaskill report, anonymous climate surveys are the best indicator to universities as far as what is the current status, the climate of sexual assault on your campus. As you saw from Dr. Kondkar's report, you get more honest answers from people when they're able to report anonymously. So when you look at different numbers on different campuses, you really can't tell on any given campus if they're doing a good job if you can't compare the reporting to the anonymous climate surveys. Even in universities like at University of Louisiana Lafayette, they had, I believe, 15 over 5 years, and they have a very robust process and they're very actively engaged on it. Well, unless I know what the numbers are on their campus anonymously, I can't tell if that number is an accurate number or not an accurate number. Obviously, there's a problem with underreporting in all the universities, but as far as how that data matches up with what's the perception is on campus, can't possibly know that. So we're looking at doing the anonymous surveys. Obviously, as you saw from the NOPD situation today, there has to be a mandated block on law enforcement training. There's an assumption, because everybody watches Law and Order SVU, that every law enforcement officer who deals with sexual assault victims has been thoroughly trained as a true expert on sexual assault. As Tanya can tell you, that is not the case whatsoever. I mean, in most departments, when you look at what officers assigned to which department, it's more intra-office politics than actual desire to be in that department. So there has to be more state interaction with how we deal with sexual assault. A couple other issues. This really came out of some of my interaction with Tulane, because Tulane's been very actively involved in this process. And I'm sure Scott will get into it when it's part of the discussion, but there has to be safe harbor provisions for universities who actually prosecute people who have committed sexual assault, because obviously there's a challenge to universities that when they go after someone who's committed a sexual assault, that person tends to have the ability to fight them in a civil matter and either A, get reinstated, or B, pursue civil damages against the university who was doing the right thing. And we as a state need to provide additional protections to universities so that they can go after people they perceive to be sexual predators and know that they're not exposing themselves to a variety of different problems in that regard. Last but not least, we have to create a truly basic framework for how we deal with sexual assault reporting and how we deal with, on a very basic level, how we educate people who come into universities. Like I said, there were certain universities like UL Monroe that had a really robust program, but they were an anomaly. They were not the average. And just like we do a lot of work in outreaching universities across the state on stuff like alcoholism, we reach out to freshmen and go, no college administrator thinks for a second students aren't going to drink. What you do hope is that by providing them with a plethora of information on drinking, the vast majority will not die of alcohol poisoning. That's kind of your hope. When you look at the epidemic that is sexual assault on college campuses, and you look at the fact that students aren't aware of very basic information, one of these litmus test ideas that I do when I go have these talks at different colleges is I talk to young men and young women, I say, are you aware that if you have sex with someone and that person is intoxicated, the part of being incapacitated, you've committed simple rape? And I can tell you 98% of them have no idea they committed a crime. And it's not even like a gray area of a crime. Under the Louisiana definition of simple rape, you have committed rape, period. And just that reaction when I'm talking to college freshmen, they have no idea what the law is. It gives me a sliver of hope that if you were to educate people on really kind of what your expectation is as a human being and an adult as they enter college, you would at least have a slightly better outcome. So those are two areas, including the climate survey, that I think the study group is chewing on initially, and hopefully will lead to some other things as well. But I think we're going to have a very robust package for next legislative session.
Scott, your last week, when you can say anything you want. Tulane is doing, I know.
Being recorded.
Yeah. Get the press here.
Yeah. It is. Right, but your last week. Tulane's doing, I know from experience, extraordinary work, really working very hard on this issue. So there's no failure of will on this campus. But it is still very difficult. And so if you could talk about the ways that the federal pressure has helped universities that you think are good ways, but also the ways that it's been problematic to try to do the dance of, what are the unintended consequences of some of this? How does when the actual tires meet the road, how is it difficult as well?
So I had no involvement in this issue, which I've coined, it's the civil rights issue of your generation. That's the way I view this. But I had no involvement in this issue up until 2011, which was the point at which the Obama administration issued its first what's called Dear Colleague letter. And in that letter, they set forth a very basic proposition, which is everybody understands sex harassment is sex discrimination and a violation of Title IX and potentially Title VII. But universities seem to think that when, and it's primarily a female student, is sexually assaulted, that's something for the police to handle. And what the Obama administration said, and I think they deserve There are a lot of things about the Obama administration. I go, they make me crazy because they make life very difficult sometimes. But on this, they deserve a ton of credit because what they said was, no, it's not something you just punt to the police department. It is sex discrimination. It creates a hostile environment within your institutional community. In universities, you have this obligation to act and do something about it. And they got very specific about what those requirements were. And this was roughly 2012, and it was you had to have certain things in your policies, and with a lot of great work with a lot of wonderful colleagues at Tulane, Abby Gaunt, our Director of Student Conduct, Julia Broussard, a number of people on the faculty, we worked for a long time to change our policies and basically get them in line with what we think are best practices. There was a part of me that in 2012 said, and that's the end of it, we can move on, and that was really stupid. Fixing policies or having policies is a very passive way of trying to solve a problem. And it's a problem that I think all of the information that was presented in terms of surveys results and was borne out by the recent MIT climate survey points to the need for institutions to fundamentally change the culture of how, in particular, male students, in particular young male students, freshmen and sophomores, interact with their female colleagues. And that is a gargantuan task. And I think let me back up. Tania said something early on about, well, some universities want to stick their head in the sand and pretend they don't have a problem. I will speak for myself. And I will speak, I think, as a representative of Tulane University on this issue. We get it. I mean, we know we have a problem. The statistic, the 1 in 5 statistic, we know we're not immune. If anything, if you look at the research in this area, the universities that have problems have a substantial on-campus population, which we do. We have an active Greek life, which we do. We have an athletics department. And you have a culture that revels, I think, in overindulgence in substances. And what I would say is, I think Tulane and Loyola self-select a lot of students who want to come here, not to admire the architecture of the city, but to go out and have a good time and drink, and to drink to, at times, oblivion. And when it's already a gray area, that even with the best of your faculties tasked with trying to figure out, am I doing the right thing, when people are impaired, really horrible decisions are made. Now, I will take a step back, and there's a great researcher, his name is David Lisak. I don't know if any of you all have heard of David Lisak, but he does a lot of wonderful research in this area. He actually came to Tulane, I want to say about 1.5 years ago. I was being a lawyer and being a jerk and going, oh, your research is a bunch of garbage, and really asking very difficult questions, which he gracefully and successfully answered on the issue of 1 in 5 and multiple perpetrators. But David Lisak was quoted in an article in New York Magazine, which I think came out this week, and I'd encourage you all to read this. There's a university in southern Oregon. And their police department is saying, we're going to do more to solve this problem. We're going to look at it as, in part, a criminal justice issue. And David Lisak, who does a lot of training for universities, was quoted as saying, and I'm roughly paraphrasing, the real tragedy in this instance is the complete failure of the criminal justice system to successfully prosecute, it's been a long day, prosecute acquaintance rape cases, which the bulk of these cases are. It's not a stranger coming out of the bush, it's somebody you know, it's somebody you're at a party with. And police departments throughout the country have basically abdicated their roles in prosecuting those cases. And he said it's created this absurd result where what should be viewed in essence, as a criminal justice issue, is foisted upon a university to handle. And we're good at educating people. We're good at, putting them in class. Maybe I taught. Maybe if you took my class, maybe not so much good at educating. But generally speaking, you learn things, and we're in the business of educating you. We're not in the business of essentially prosecuting criminal cases. And what I found as a practical matter is we have really had to staff up our efforts on the investigation end of things. I refer to, and by the way, in a climate where the Obama administration and your parents are saying, keep the cost of education down. This is a very resource-intensive exercise. The MIT came out with the results of a climate survey recently. And they said, look, 1 in 5 of our students are victims of sex assault. 5% of that 1 in 5 report. One of the things that we're trying to do as a preliminary step is encourage reporting, create safe havens for reporting, so that principally we can get resources to people who need resources. I assume the reporting at Tulane is close to 5% as well. If it goes to 25%, which I think is a modest goal, poor Julia is going to be working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're going to have to staff it appropriately. That's a real challenge. In terms of measuring success, I agree totally with JP. The best indication of what's going on in your campus is not the Clary report. It's not the number of reports that you're getting in. We know this is an underreported crime. It's going to be in response to anonymous climate surveys. Tulane will issue ours next semester after freshmen have had a semester experience. We're looking forward to getting the results of that, which I suspect will be public. Success will be measured in reducing the incidence. That's what success is going to look like. And there are a lot of efforts underway to do that. Tara mentioned this issue, and I couldn't agree more, which is this cannot be viewed as this is the administration's responsibility, and if they don't do it, oh my God, we're going to rally and all this sort of stuff. This is a community. It's something the entire community needs to rally around. Staff, faculty, administrators, and students to fundamentally change the culture. Some of that's in bystander programs. Some of that is in education, offering certain classes, doing training, all that sort of stuff. But I think it's important for students to be engaged on this issue, and there are a lot of opportunities to do that. As far as the Inspector General's report that came out today by NOPD, not only does our criminal justice system in New Orleans have a problem prosecuting acquaintance rape, we have a problem investigating stranger rape in this city, which puts the onus even more on Tulane and Loyola and all the other universities in this community to handle these things. I'll leave with one last point. One of the trickiest areas from a legal perspective is when one student accuses another student of sexual misconduct or sex assault. In one world, which doesn't exist and which is a fantasy, we could say once a student is accused of sexual assault, kick them out, right? And even for advocates, nobody views that as a fair process. When these issues come up, they raise very challenging due process questions that universities wrestle with. And I say this all the time. There's not an instance in my 6 years at this university where following an adjudication, an internal adjudication of a sex assault case, somebody wasn't very upset with the end result. You're either telling a victim, we think we don't believe you, or that's the way it's interpreted, or you didn't give us enough evidence, or we're telling someone who says, I didn't do anything wrong, and it's very rare, by the way, that anyone admits to doing it, that you are a sex assaulter, and you need to walk around with that scarlet red letter. And so what happens, regardless of how those things work out, we either get litigation, and we get a lot of litigation from male students who are disciplined, not only at Tulane and Loyola, but institutions throughout the country. But what you're finding is women primarily who are victims and didn't get the result that they wanted are also pursuing litigation. So these are really complicated issues. I think I'm very proud of the work we've done in this area. I think there is going to be a big push over the next several years to resource it appropriately.
Is it the phones that causing static?
Sorry?
Is it the phones causing static? Should we turn off phones?
Is there static?
Yeah, they don't, not.
Probably is.
If you guys are willing to turn off your phone, it's difficult, but, so Julia, you can talk to us about, all sorts of things, and then I'm going to kick it to you guys to be thinking of your questions, because there's nothing I can ask that you won't ask better. The university finds itself between this rock and a hard place. Either way you go, when there's an accusation and you've got to act on it, you're going to disappoint somebody and possibly get sued. How do these cases end up playing out? What's it like being on the ground with these cases? And then finally, how do we prevent this, right? We're never going to do that well after the fact in having any satisfying conclusion to this. So how do we make it stop? What's the latest thought on prevention efforts of talking to female students about reducing risk, but also talking to male students about not raping without offending the vast majority who would never do something like that, right?
All right. So I guess to first start off with what it's like on the ground to be involved in these cases, to work with the victims and to work with the adjudication. My role is as a victim advocate on campus. So first and foremost, I'm working with victims and survivors to help get them connected with resources, with whatever support they need. But then I am sitting down with the student and talking with them about, here's your options to adjudicate the case internally if the perpetrator is a student, faculty, staff, somehow affiliated with Tulane. And for tonight, I'm going to focus on our student-on-student cases, because I think that's really what we're concerned with tonight. And also talking with them about whether or not they want to go through the criminal justice process, because they can pursue both options. I think one initial challenge right off the bat is that someone who's been through a trauma, I am not a neuroscientist, so pardon my super simplistic explanation of this, but they have a hard time focusing, concentrating, processing, and retaining and recalling information. So I'm sitting down with them and offering them this big list of resources, going through all these options with them, which on the one hand I think is great that at Tulane we have all these resources to offer, that they have so many options. But on the flip side, can be really overwhelming for someone who's experienced a trauma and is not processing at a normal level. So I think that's one challenge right off the bat. Another challenge, and one of the benefits of being the final panelist to kind of give a little spiel tonight, is that a lot of y'all have hit on the points that I wanted to hit on. I think, Marcus, you did a great job of speaking to so many victims don't want to report this. I hear a lot of self-blame, and I think some of that self-blame speaks to a cultural issue. People don't just start blaming themselves for things in a vacuum. It's because of messages they're hearing in society and from their peers. My colleague Megan Lee-Vakari, who's here, did some focus groups, I guess a couple years ago now, when we were doing some research for our bystander intervention program. And what she heard over and over again from students is that there's this peer pressure to define a sexual assault as a bad hookup, that peer pressure exists on Tulane's campus within this hookup culture. I also hear from so many survivors that they're worried about the repercussions of reporting. Not that they are worried about, retaliation from the university, but I think social repercussions, because if it is an acquaintance, a lot of times it's someone who's in the same social groups as them. I also hear so many more times than I wish to hear it, I don't want to ruin his life. And I'm saying his because the majority of the survivors I work with are women. I think male sexual assault is even more severely underreported. due to the stigma around being a male survivor of sexual assault. So often I hear from students, I don't want to ruin his life, I don't want to ruin his life. And so they're reticent to go to the conduct process because we do tell them this is something where suspension or expulsion is going to be on the table. And it's not your decision about whether someone is suspended or expelled. We don't put that, pressure or weight on you, but they still feel like I'm going to be responsible for ruining this person's life by reporting it. And I think some of that stems also from the self-blame that people are feeling. If I'm partly responsible for what happened, then I'm also partly responsible for ruining this person's life by holding them accountable. I also hear from so many victims, and think about it, these are the ones who even take the step to come forward and talk to me, that they're in this place where they're not fully defining it as a sexual assault, and they kind of want to believe that maybe this was just an accident by this person, a miscommunication, they didn't mean to harm them. Which I get why people want to believe that, because that's a much less scary reality to face than this person intentionally harmed me. This guy who's in my calculus class or who's friends with my sorority sister intentionally did this really violent and harmful thing to me. So that's really difficult. Another piece to consider is that someone who's experienced a trauma oftentimes will alternate between these symptoms of numbing and flooding. So the numbing is, I'm going to shut down emotionally, I don't want to think about this, I don't want to think about what happened to me. And then the flooding is, I'm overwhelmed by remembering what happened, I'm having flashbacks, I'm having panic attacks. And so someone who's alternating between those two things, the last thing they want to do is sit down with an investigator and have to rehash the details and relive that and confront that, and potentially experience that overwhelming flooding of emotion. So that can be really scary, regardless of whether we're talking about the conduct process or the criminal justice process, to really have to go through a process where you're going to be, at every step of the way, forced to confront what happened to you in this reality. I think another piece that is really tough is if a survivor does decide to go through the adjudication process, in that process is inherently set up to where their credibility is going to be questioned. We hope that it's not the police and the district attorney's office who are calling their credibility into question, but at the point where the case is really being adjudicated, their credibility gets called into question, and that can feel really damaging for a survivor. I think a lot of them also, I hear fear about just being in the presence of the perpetrator, and even though with our conduct process at Tulane, we try to make accommodations to where you wouldn't have to be in the same room. I had one survivor tell me, even being on the phone with him and knowing he's on the other end, feels really emotionally overwhelming for me. I don't think I can handle that. And we also get put in a tough position sometimes when we have survivors who maybe share the name of the perpetrator with us, or we get some details about the assault, but the survivor isn't interested in going forward with the adjudication process and participating in that. Because then we're in a position where we have information that one of our students may be a rapist, maybe someone who poses a danger to other students, but we don't have enough information to go forward with charging them and removing them from our campus. And so at best, we can maybe have a conversation with that student. We can keep that name on file in case we get any other reports, but that's a tough position to be in. And I think Scott really spoke to some of the issues that he says 100% of the time, 50% of the participants are going to be unhappy. Sometimes 100% of the participants are unhappy. And we are seeing, I think, an increase in litigation after these cases have come through. And, coming from a victim perspective, even I can appreciate that we need to have due process rights for the accused student, and that this process can be really emotional and scary for them as well. And that also translates to that these cases are really difficult for the staff who work with them. They're really emotionally draining, and a lot of them can end up just taking up a lot of time too, that it's hard to sometimes feel like you have the resources to address everything. One of the principles as a social worker that I try to abide by is do no harm. And I think sometimes we do have to sit down and say, are we doing harm with this? We don't intend to, but we're trying to look at our processes and make sure that we're not increasing the harm that has occurred to the student, because there is some really good research coming out of Oregon about this issue of institutional betrayal, where someone whose sexual assault has occurred in the context of an institution that they were supposed to depend on for their safety, so like a church or a university or maybe a fraternity or sorority that they were a member of, when they don't feel like that institution adequately responds to their the incident, when they don't feel like they've been appropriately responded to and addressed, it can actually exacerbate their trauma symptoms and make them worse. And so that's what, at the very least, I want to make sure we're not making people's trauma symptoms worse, but sometimes even with the best intentions, it's hard to avoid that because we can't always know what an outcome is going to be. When I'm working with victims and survivors, kind of the overarching questions that I encourage them to think about when they're deciding whether or not to go through the conduct process or the criminal justice process is, what are you hoping to get out of this, and is this going to help you heal? At a philosophical level, would I like to see everyone report and we try to prosecute and adjudicate and get these people off of our campuses and out of our communities? Yes, but at an individual level, when I have a survivor sitting in front of me, I want them to do what's going to help them heal. And in some cases, that is going through this process. In some cases, that's not. And in a lot of cases, it's really hard to know if it's going to help them. I can say the only thing I can really guarantee you with this process is that it's going to be an opportunity for you to have your voice heard and to try to hold this person accountable, but I can't guarantee any outcomes. We just can't, and so that's tough. And I do want to speak a little bit to the prevention piece too that Tania asked me to speak on. I am super excited at Tulane. Over the past couple years, we have started implementing a bystander intervention program called One Wave. That's really meant to be a comprehensive program for our whole community to engage the community in keeping one another safe. And some of the research behind bystander intervention that makes it really compelling to me is, we can talk about risk reduction and give victims tips on how to try to avoid being raped. Statistically speaking, if you're drinking, you're more at risk, those sorts of things. But it's very hard to do that without coming across as victim blaming. And I don't want to contribute to that voice in the survivor's head that's saying, well, you shouldn't have been out drinking, this is why this happened. And then at the same time, we have some research from people like David Lisak that says that the perpetrators of this behavior are pretty predatory, so they're not going to be swayed by me giving them a talk about consent. I think there is a place for consent education because I think a lot of our students just grapple with what are healthy relationships, how do we have healthy sexual interactions. But you're not going to sway a perpetrator with that. And so the bystander intervention is really about how do we engage the people who are going to be around in kind of the beginning stages of something risky that could turn into a sexual assault, and how do we get them to act in really realistic ways. And so I see that as really being the centerpiece of our prevention efforts at Tulane, but we are also we have some efforts to educate students on policy. We have all of our incoming students do an online program. They attend a larger program during move-in weekend and then also have some small group discussions. There's some booster stuff throughout the year. We have events like Take Back the Night, SAFE does Project Clothesline, which helps to raise awareness. But I'm super excited about our bystander piece because I really do see that as a promising area and a really positive way to look at this. We're not telling men don't rape and accusing them all of being rapists. We're not telling women how to not get raped. We're helping one another learn how to take care of one another.
Turn them both. Tell who you are.
Hi. Okay, my name is Sydney, and I know on November 2nd, Emory University suspended Greek life because they had a sexual assault at SAE. So I was wondering kind of if Tulane would ever take measures towards that, how Tulane feels about that. Yeah, thanks.
And is Greek life, is that part of the solution and Greek life across the board, not just at Tulane, or is that not the answer? It's your last week, Scott.
I'm not a huge Greek life fan, and I'll leave it at that. At the same time, I will say, at least in my experience at Tulane, Um, We've had a number of incidents that started at fraternity houses. I mean, let's just be blunt. But I would say over the last couple of years, what I've seen is, and whether it's motivated by self-interest and concern about litigation, or concern about self-preservation, that fraternity groups in particular and sororities have taken the initiative on, educating members and all that sort of stuff. There was a pretty interesting series of articles in the Atlantic about Greek life and how completely out of control most Greek life organizations are at universities, and it wasn't entirely clear to me. It was clear to me what the cost of Greek life were and what some of the risks were. It wasn't entirely clear to me what the utility to the institution was. I will say this, there's also, I think you need to be a little careful about painting with very broad brushstrokes. Not every fraternity and sorority is bad. There are some, and I can tell you there is some institutional experience here that when a fraternity does something and gets completely out of hand, they get extracted from the university. And some of that predates my time here. I know Tara might have some opinions on that as well. It comes up, I will say this, it frequently comes up when we talk about policy issues at the university. It frequently comes up because the perception, and I don't know if it's the reality, is that a lot of instances of sexual misconduct are starting at fraternity events where there's excessive alcohol, and I'd go a step further, where it almost seems like the setup for some events seems to be get people so drunk and incapacitated that you have sex with them. So, I mean, those are some very general thoughts. I think there's some really good fraternities who have taken an ownership interest in this. There are some bad fraternities. And I want to speak to this. I mean, I can only tell you in my anecdotal experience, the connection between the people who come to us with complaints about sexual misconduct and considerable alcohol use, the connection is, at least in my opinion, undeniable. And if you look at the MIT report, they said the same thing. I think Tulane, and I can only speak to Tulane, and I sort of alluded to this, has a real problem with alcohol use. And I know at Dartmouth, for instance, when the new president came in, he said, look, we've got this culture of partying and having a great time. It's out of control. We're a higher education institution. We're not a sandals resort, okay? You're not coming here to party and get loaded. Something has to change in the culture. Some of that is policy driven. I know there's a lot of discussion institutionally about, for fraternity events or Greek life events, will we allow or sanction alcohol use? We are one of the few universities in the country that you can go to a football stadium and buy alcohol. That doesn't happen in any SEC school, for instance, which really surprised me. So I have heard issues about Greek life. I tell you, whenever we dig deeply, it really doesn't pan out. But it comes up so many times that you've got to think where there's smoke, there's fire. But I do think on Tulane's campus, there really has to be a very strong look about the culture of alcohol and trying to figure out a way to get that under control. And I'll say this, it doesn't always just, by the way, manifest itself in a sex assault. The collateral damage from overuse of alcohol or overuse of substances, we have kids, TEMS is a verb, right? This is insane.
This is our emergency response of ambulance service.
Yeah, and I will tell you, the number of students who get transported to a hospital for alcohol poisoning is off the charts. I've done my fair share of drinking. I've never gotten so drunk that someone had to take me to the hospital. That happens on a regular basis. And I can go on and on and on. So,
Tara,
Tara
what do
might
you
have some
think?
better stuff.
You guys are gonna get me heated so early on. I'm gonna go ahead and start. I'm pretty biased on this issue because I'm a part of Greek Life at Tulane. But what I can say is part of this research that Dr. David Lisak does says that it's very few perpetrators who perpetrate a significant number of times. So what the problem is cultures amongst fraternities and sororities that allow this behavior to continue. And I don't think that calls for the end of Greek life at Tulane. I think that's just giving up on the issue. To me, that's the same logic as saying, you know, it occurs at higher rates in colleges and universities, so let's just shut them all down. Because you know what? Greek life gave me a platform for leadership. It gave me a platform to be on this stage right now to talk to people about sexual assault on college campuses. So it's not like it doesn't have its attributes. It's just a part of campus that needs more comprehensive and intensified educational programs where people can learn the implications of some of their actions, including, you know, misogynistic party themes and stuff like that. That contributes to this culture that allows it to happen. But by no means is it only fraternity and sorority life. So it needs to be a culture change on campus as well.
I will say this, I would love, this is my great risk management tool, I would love for us to go fully online. This problem doesn't exist at the University of Phoenix.
Hi, I'm Fritz. I'm with Louisiana Weekly. I was wondering, what is a recommended strategy for a university to pursue due process? Since you're not a law enforcement institution, is there like a best practice standard you have in your head about, is it as simple as just interviewing the participant, the parties at hand, and witnesses? Or should there be more advanced investigative techniques eventually involved? I'm curious to know, what is the due process when a university is left, when the cops punt on it and a university has to handle themselves? What is the due process?
Well, let me put a finer point on that. Even when cops don't punt on it, the university has an independent obligation to investigate and take prompt remedial action if they find there's a problem, all right? So the fact that NOPD might be involved or the district attorney might be involved doesn't absolve the university from doing its own due process. I can tell you what we do at Tulane. And I think we're in line with best practice, but I think best practice, everybody is kind of constantly thinking about, is this the best way to do it?
I think if you could invent the best way to do it, you would make millions. Like everyone is looking for that right now.
Yeah. All right. So we hire, we actually have people employed on staff who are trained investigators. They go to training. They're actually in a training right now in Richmond, Virginia. Who, anytime there's a complaint of sexual misconduct that involves two of our students, go out and conduct a very thorough investigation. At a minimum, that involves interviewing people. There might be extrinsic evidence, video cameras, you know, there might be other witnesses. They touch, you know, they interview all of those people and conduct a very thorough investigation. I will say this, and I'm not trying to bash NOPD, they're being bashed enough. But there was a recent case where we had an investigation of a sex assault, and NOPD had an investigation of a sex assault. And I will tell you, our investigation was 20 times better than what NOPD did. Our documentation was around, I think, 500 pages of interview notes and all kinds of extrinsic other evidence. So that's where it starts. And then the question is, who hears the case? Who hears the evidence and makes the decisions? One of the interesting issues that I think all universities are facing right now is, do you get a single person? Right? And it's called a magistrate model, who hears all of the facts and makes a decision, yay or nay, this happened. I will say at Harvard, for instance, that's the model that they have gone through. And recently, some of the most high-profile law professors at Harvard, at Alan Dershowitz, the con law folks said, this is a horrible mistake. We don't like the way you're doing this. At Tulane, what we do is sort of like a jury system. We have these cases are adjudicated by a member of the faculty, staff, and students. They all get special training on all the issues that are unique to sexual assault and kind of what I would say is atypical behavior or someone who is the victim of a sex assault. You hear like some of the myths are, well, why, would they post something happy on Facebook the next day? And there's this whole neurobiology of trauma, and we give training to those families. That's the way we do it. We present them with all the information that we've gathered in our investigation. I think the other complicating thing for us is, according to the Department of Education, we're on a tight timeline. We're supposed to adjudicate these things, adjudicate within a 90-day window, which is a very ambitious schedule. But that's the way we do it. Within our code of student conduct, in terms of maintaining due process rights, we say, look, the victim has certain rights. The accused has certain rights, and they're very similar to what if you had a criminal trial, the sort of rights you would have there as well. What we come back to as a fundamental principle is it's hard for universities because these are both our students. We can't immediately assume that just because someone has been accused that they've done something wrong. And we've tried to set up a system that provides as many protections as possible.
One comment on that, and I think it's very important as we're having this, because this discussion is not just about Tulane, it's about the community and the city in general. Tulane expends tremendous resources in this regard. They are not atypical. In the state of Louisiana, I'd say they're the aberration as far as how active they are in trying to create a process that is somewhat fair and somewhat involved. The challenge we really have in trying to solve this legislatively is that there are many institutions across this state that have nowhere near the resources of Tulane. So when you're trying to create a process on a statewide level, try and create a baseline as to what universities are going to do, you have to take into account that some universities, and I had this comment with someone else, some universities have one person that handles everything in regard to sexual assault, sexual harassment. They have no investigators and no process. And the challenge you have trying to solve the problem across the state is, how do you create a baseline process that incorporates some of what Tulane does to a school, let's say like Grambling, that has none of those resources whatsoever, has no investigator, may have one person who is the victim's rights coordinator, the person who interviews the individual who's accused, the person who has to go hunt down 3 people who aren't trained to sit on a panel if they have a panel. I mean, you really are creating something out of nothing. So as we're talking about this holistically as a community, when you look at Tulane, you look at the universities in this area, they have tremendous resources that other universities simply don't have. And everyone who goes to the university should be very grateful that they dedicate those resources to it. It's really an aberration.
I'd go a step further. God bless our governor, who is perpetually running for president of the United States. He's cut higher education, and in defense of the public universities in this state, he's cut dramatically higher education funding. As I said in my opening remarks, now it's resource intensive. If people start complaining more, they listen to our outreach efforts, it's going to increase exponentially. And so the demands for more staffing in this area are only going to increase. And, I'm going to get political for a second, but, God bless these legislators, JP excluded, who's been an advocate for increasing higher education spending, who are just cutting it. And so for publics, I don't know how they deal with it. Our pressure is to keep tuition costs down, which is, I think, going to be very difficult in this climate as well.
So I'm actually going to take a couple of questions in a row just so we can get through a few more as we run out of time.
I don't have a question. I'm Abby Gahn. I work with Scott and Julia closely on these issues. I just want to follow up on Scott's comments in response to your question about best practices. Scott described our practice. I don't think anybody at Tulane is tied to that practice. We are constantly looking at what best practices are, how we can improve our own process. The provost of the university sent out a call to the community asking for input. He described what it is. I think we've made a lot of improvements over the last couple of years, but that's not the stopping point. So.
Yeah, there's no arrogance at Tulane where we go, oh, it's so great, we're wonderful, shut up. We're constantly looking for constructive feedback.
So I did my undergrad at Tulane, and I'm a master's student right now. And I found throughout my entire time at Tulane, and I'm sure this is not a unique experience at other schools in Louisiana, a huge kind of overwhelming bureaucratic feeling. I was unfortunate to know a lot of women who are victims of sexual assault and of rape on campus. And when I was trying to help them work through their experiences, trying to get them to report, it was just kind of, I was met with at Tulane just a bunch of, and even with the city, a bunch of just kind of, well, there's nothing we can do, there's nothing we can do for you. And even one of my professors made some inflammatory comments that I didn't think were appropriate and I thought were very victim blaming. And I tried to move forward with that, and I was again met with nothing. So how do you flip that script where you can solve that problem?
And actually, let me take some more questions before you respond to that. Who else?
This is an unscientific question. It's really anecdotal. Obviously, there's a lot of underreporting that goes on, so a lot of truth is obscured. But in your experience, do you find that when you're dealing with an episode, it's a one-off episode, or do you find you keep hearing the same guy's names again and again?
So far it's mostly one-off, but we have had a few where the same name comes up, and that's a situation where it's a lot stronger of a case to try to adjudicate. There's a lot of people though where maybe this is the only time the student's name has come up, but with the way the victim is describing the assault, it fits very neatly in with David Lisak and other people's research on how sexual predators operate, and so I suspect that they have had multiple victims.
For Dr. Kondkar, there are not a ton of There are not a ton of male students in this room. I'm not going to get high and mighty either. I work at Hillel, that's why I'm here. But no, now that I sat through the panel, and I think this is the first time that I've been exposed to a real conversation and not felt like I've been talked at and talked down to being a male, trying to get educated about this stuff. What is the strategy for getting more males in here and fixing the percentages that we saw in red in your PowerPoint?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not lost on me that most of the men here are either on the panel or work here. But I do think that I think we're also coming at it from rather different things. I mean, I think you all are dealing with it, at least the two of you who work here tonight, are dealing with it after it's come to you, and now you have to figure out what to do with it. Whereas I think a little more, I have the luxury of being able to think a bit more globally about it, and I think that we really have to have a conversation about masculinity as well. We live in a society where we, through a myriad of ways, we socialize men to perform masculinity through a lens of power and control that includes controlling other people, including women. And rape and sexual assault is an extreme but very logical result of that. And I think until we start having some of those conversations, I think that in my looking at things, especially when we look at rape law reform, I think we've sort of hit the wall with the way we can sort of punish it. And I think that the more hopeful part of it is the preventative stuff. And I think there's a danger in pathologizing the rapist as this awful monster who's this sort of deviation from the norm. It's not a deviation from the norm, it's just a logical extension of it. And I think I'm fairly hopeful about it because I've seen, on the one hand, we're looking at 50 years of research that suggests that nothing's changed. What has actually changed is campus resources. And these conversations. People weren't even talking about these in classrooms, even 20, 30 years ago. So those things are changing, but I'm very hopeful because of what we've seen with fatherhood, which is another way in which masculinity has really been redefined. It's been slow, but even within a couple of generations, I mean, I think of my grandfather, and what I'm now allowed to do as a father is just completely night and day. And so that's part of redefining masculinity, and I think if we keep on that project, and it's very difficult because we want to sort of select bits of masculinity that are not particularly healthy without taking it all away. But I think that slowly, in terms of a big picture, I think that's probably where the work has to be done.
We're going to go about 10 more minutes and then walk in the lobby. Where- Oh, and if you want to answer the question about sort of, I mean, how you create a response that is not too institutionalized, how the bevy of possible options isn't overwhelming, and
Well, I mean,
that continuing effort.
I don't know that the resources are, there's a bureaucracy to get access to the resources. In terms of pursuing like an internal disciplinary system, I don't know what to say other than at some level that has to be an adversarial process, and I don't know, bureaucratic is the way I would describe it, but I don't know that I would describe it as straightforward and simple either. And we would love to figure out a way to make it as simple as possible, but I don't know that there is one. I mean, I would entertain suggestions in that regard. But, you know, any process where you have competing versions of what happened, whether it's a criminal trial, a civil trial, or something like this, is going to be difficult and bureaucratic and maybe, you know, a little slow. I don't know if that's satisfactory, but that's my answer.
Well, I would add to that, because it sounded like maybe what you were getting at is that you had this sense when you were a student that the administration was just apathetic to this, that people were coming forward and it was being swept under the rug. I'm a Tulane graduate myself. I attended from 2006 to 2010, and that was kind of the impression I had of campus too, although it wasn't very well informed in retrospect. It was kind of like these snippets of things that I heard on campus. And I came into Tulane in 2012, so I can't really speak to how things were done before then, but I came in, you heard from Scott about this kind of sea change that occurred in 2011, so I came in at a time when there was a ton of focus being put on what are our processes, what are our resources, and you know, I hope if that was going on when you were a student, and if it was going on when I was a student, I think it's totally different now. Not to say there's still, you know, there's more training we could be doing with our faculty and staff, but I do feel pretty good that the people we have in the positions of providing services to our survivors and taking in those complaints and investigating the cases have a good amount of training in how to respond and are taking them seriously. We're not trying to like hush up anyone or shoo them away or hide them. I think one piece though that's still tricky is that if the cases are being internally adjudicated, they're confidential. So I'll still hear from students here and there, oh yeah, I heard a guy on my floor got accused of sexual assault, but who knows what happened with that? Because we're in a tough position where we can't publicize, yeah, we expelled that guy, or, well, we suspended him, and these are the reasons why.
I will add one thing, and I'll be honest, I've worked in a university for 6 years. Universities are incredibly image conscious, right? And I don't get the sense that anybody's out there in like the promotional materials actively advertising it. 1 in 5 of our students is going to be the victim of a sex assault. But I will say, because I've had conversations in, you know, the spaceship that is Gibson Hall with everybody, everybody gets it, and nobody pretends like we don't have this problem. If anything, they go, yeah, we've got the problem, frankly, as bad, you know, as any of the universities that are out there. But, you know, we act, maybe to your point, I don't know, are we actively touting that? Is the institution touting that? No, although I will say, when the semester started, the provost of the university sent a broad communication, not only to students, but to faculty and staff, alums, the entire university community, saying, look, we've got a problem. We're looking for the community. We've done some things. We're looking for your input too. So those are my thoughts on it.
Okay, we're going to get a couple more questions, and I'll do a few in a row.
Yeah, mine's not so much a question as just sort of an observation and something you've echoed in different ways on the panel. You know, I deal with a lot of students and do a lot of informal teaching and counseling, and it does seem to me that there's a sort of a less than adolescent orientation towards relationships with this particular generation. There's a sort of, not that my generation, we were so evolved when I was 18, but there's something that, there's an aspect of this particular generation, and I'm not sure exactly what it is, where maybe it's, you know, maybe it's media, maybe it's texting, maybe it's just, you know, people being, you know, plugged into their phones rather than each other, but there's a sense of a unevolved sense of relationship with each other, and being able to communicate. And I just sort of, I see this just, you know, I recently had a conversation with a bunch of like 20 AE5 girls, and it was just alarming, you know. There was just such a frustration, you know, universally, of how guys are, and it was like guys at Tulane. It's a cultural. There's something deeply cultural, and I don't think it's specific to Tulane, but I do think it's generational, and it's just something that I see, and I think it feeds directly into this.
I just wanted to respond to this as a student here, that what I see it as is a freedom of sexuality, that we've opened up as a culture not as less evolved, but as more evolved in that we're more willing to talk about it, in the sense that we are more willing to have sex and discuss sex in a way that's more open than I think older generations do. So I just wanted to respond to that in like the argument, but I do agree that people say they don't like the hookup culture and they wish it changed, but it's the dichotomy there that it's like relationships are kind of old school and hookups are kind of new
Can I comment on
expressive.
that?
Are we representing old school?
I'm representing one of the challenges we kind of face as a legislature, and I'll say, I think that an argument can be made that there is a disconnect, I think, so to speak, in that things that people I see those between your two generations. I'm 36, I'm the youngest person in the legislature, and I have to explain tweeting to people who regulate everything frequently. And I'll tell you, the thing is that though I do agree there is a greater freedom as far as sexual expression, there are challenges that young people face now that were not even fathomable when I was in college. There was no revenge porn when I was in college. Okay, the thing is that young women coming to college, they think that young women and men think they're adults. Because of the disconnect, and I do think there is a technological disconnect where people have these relationships that are partially managed through technology, not truly personal, they do things without realizing the repercussions to other people. And I can tell you, we had a bill that Melena Moreno authored that dealt with online impersonation and revenge porn, and it was very difficult to explain to other legislators. The average age in the House is 55 and in the Senate is 60. So trying to explain to people this is a problem, that's something we have to protect people from, they just couldn't even fathom it. And it's really a challenge you guys faced that we never faced. I mean, there was no opportunity other than, I guess, a racy, I mean, for me it would have been an email, for you probably a picture circulating around your friends if something went south. There are things that you do now as an 18 or 19-year-old that will follow you forever.
You didn't have a mixtape?
We have mixtapes.
Oh, my Lord. Tapes.
Marcus, do you want to comment on hookup culture and some of that sociologically?
No, I mean, I think that there's so much written about it, and I agree with exactly what you said. I think that as women in particular, just being a little bit more autonomous sexually, that's challenging a lot of traditional ideas, and sometimes that's getting scapegoated is the problem, which I do not think is the problem. That's another dangerous path to go down, I think. So, hookup culture has been, it's been seen as something, I don't want to say too much about it actually in the context of sexual assault, really, because I think that's just adding fuel to that fire. I don't think that's the problem at all.
Well, and following that point, I think one of the greatest challenges we have in trying to, on the education side, really educate individuals, and it's to the great question from the audience over here on the right, the focus has been historically that when you're trying to prevent sexual assault, the focus has been on educating women on how to be safer. That ship has sailed. I think the challenge that really is going forward on dealing with this issue is you have to not put the onus on women that you need to do, not put yourself in a situation. You have to educate men on what sexual assault is and what your responsibilities are in situations, because I can tell you, at least in Louisiana, we have not been doing that. We have not, when you have focuses going on as far as how to prevent sexual assault, it's usually, and for a lot of colleges, it's like a self-defense class, you know, how to knee a guy in the groin and run away when he tries to attack you, or don't drink. I think that puts an onus on the woman and a presumption that they've done something wrong, when in reality, college men are just as clueless as college women on sexual relationships, and both need to be educated on the topic.
Well, let me add one. When we talk about, so we have this committee, it has students on it, and staff and faculty. You know, we're trying to be as progressive as possible on initiatives, and one of the things, you know, we talk about is, look, we need to do these training programs and all that, and we do, which go in one ear and out the other. But are there courses that we could add to the core curriculum of the university, whether it's a gender studies course or something along those lines that would fundamentally change the way, or at least make people think about these things in more sophisticated ways? And I suspect that may happen sooner rather than later.
But I would say this doesn't always have to occur in sort of an academic setting where you're having the university tell you. This goes back to sort of this autonomy we have with our sexuality now, but also engaging in honest conversations about sex. So right now I think the problem is when people talk about these things, they operate on sort of their perceived notions of what's normal. So they try and match up to that rather than having honest discussions about what their sexuality is like, and you know what is healthy versus what's not.
I'm going to take these two questions in a row, and then I think we're out of time. So.
Hi, my name is Logan, and I'm from Dillard University, so I'm a visitor.
Walter.
And it was several things that I wanted to talk about. You know, being a small institution, you know, we don't have a whole bunch of investigators. But I'm the director of risk management, so I want to talk about if you don't pay for it on the front end, you're going to pay for it on the back end. And that's where the lawsuits and things like that come. And for as information, what I thought, when you have a big group of people, you get folks in that group lost. They're not paying attention, folks on their cell phones, whole bunch of things going on. So what I did for faculty and staff, I broke them up into smaller groups so we can have discussions on how you can identify someone that may have a situation. You know, it could be a person that was a perfect student and all of a sudden they're not coming to class anymore. So when I broke them up into the smaller groups, it was so much information came out of those smaller groups where it helped us, okay, we need to do this or we need to do that. Now, for as the perpetrator, I always say, wow, it's not just about education now. We have so many other things that we have to worry about. Look, you came to school for education. There's a criminal element here where you can leave a different way, you know. And information, for us, information that's put out there in packets or whatever, let the parents know. You know, they don't know what their kids are doing. At least they play like they know. You know what I mean? But when a parent, you know, I have a son that's in college, and we talk about those things. You know, it's like, you know, you in a relationship with this person, you know, talk about what's going on. And I think so from the parent perspective, from faculty and staff on keeping those eyes open and doing their bystanders duties, and throughout the year, just different things. It can maybe be a situation like this where we can say, bring a male friend. we know they won't come on their on their own. So maybe we may say, bring a male friend, and that's how we get the males to come. It's just some thoughts. I got a whole bunch of stuff.
My question was sort of along some of the conversation we've been having about how we have open conversations about sexuality with students and how they have that with one another. I've been really intrigued by the new law that California passed that requires affirmative consent at every stage of a relationship. And, you know, I think that in some ways that kind of forces people to have conversations about what they're doing in the context of whether it be a hookup or a more serious relationship. And so I'm really curious to hear from y'all what your perspectives are on a policy like that. If you think it's something that, you know, Loyola or Tulane has explored, is it something that we as a state want to look at?
Well, I think it's important for the get-go. We're talking about the yes means yes situation in California. That was not done at an institutional level. That was done at a state level. They passed a law. And the number one challenge I think we can get with there, and Tania's already, we're on the same level here. You're talking about California versus Louisiana. So I've already started to try and seed that idea with colleagues, and there are people here who don't believe in climate change. So when you're trying to talk about the idea of trying to bring some kind of consistency to try and address this issue from a legislative perspective in that level of interpersonal communication, I can tell you the typical people who you would think would be for that are for it, and the people that you would think would be against it are against it, and unfortunately they outnumber us probably 5-1. So as far as, I think it's an interesting idea, and I think as far as you could legally do that, as far as an institutional policy, I think that'd be great. I don't think you could do yes means yes in Louisiana without legislation, which is why I did legislation in California, because that's really what laid the universal playing field, so to speak, in California, and made it work. If you do it on a campus-by-campus basis, the number one challenge you'd have is what happens when you have one kid from Loyola and one kid from Tulane, and they have two different models that they're supposed to be following. So I think it's why in California they went for the legislative angle, and I mean, I tilt at windmills all the time in the legislature, and I'll probably tilt at that windmill too, but I think this state is nowhere near being progressive enough to really do that.
We have a professor, do y'all know Fred Gutel in social work?
Yes.
I love Fred. Fred teaches in this area and talks a lot about peer education, students educating other students. And we talk about this issue all the time. And Fred said one great measure of success is that female students at the end of their experience at Tulane say the male students were the most awkward students they've ever met in their lives. That in every instance of sexual intercourse or whatever, all along the way, they are seeking over and over affirmative consent, which is, I think, codified in our code. The interesting thing about yes, or I think the challenging thing about the California legislation is the burden to prove consent in each step. Affirmative consent is on the person accused, which I think is a challenge. I mean, I have as a lawyer some concerns about how difficult that might be. But the idea of there should be affirmative consent for each sexual act, I'm totally on board with, and we do that.
Yeah, that's in Tulane's code of conduct.
So I am so sad to start shutting this down because we have so many more people who want to talk, and this has been amazing. I want to thank our panelists, Julia and Scott, for toiling in the field. Scott, you're about to be let go, but you have done extraordinary work.
Vacation coming up.
Exactly. Tara for inspiring and organizing our fellow students, for getting a lot of you there. For JP for being Don Quixote of the State Senate. We are so grateful. And for Marcus for illuminating this problem, for studying it, for bringing the problem to our attention, for making people believe that it exists. So thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it over to Yona to talk to you about staying and eating and asking your questions directly.
I just want to say first of all, a big thank you to Tania to moderate tonight. And, you know, I would love to do a follow-up to this, and I really would love for the room to be filled with some more men. So I really want to thank everybody who came on the panel, as well as all of you. I just feel like this is super important. I feel like, you know, however we understand it, however we engage with it, we need to do more of it. I'm personally throwing it out there. If anybody wants to organize something, using Hillel as a network to do that, we're connected to a whole bunch of students, and we'd love to sort of play some role in helping to continue the conversation with a certain degree of honesty, which I think is critical. So thank you, everybody. We are going to do, this is, again, a number of different events throughout the year, a number of different issues. You signed in, you're on the listserv, you'll receive the latest and the greatest. Thanks again. Eat, enjoy, continue.